Today, I've got a big idea I want to share with you, which is that I think I have a theory that explains the real difference between science fiction and fantasy. And what it comes down to is that it's about the pre modern worldview versus the modern or postmodern worldview informing the material and its creation. So let me explain my terms for a minute here. When I talk about the pre modern worldview, I'm talking about the pre scientific worldview, the worldview that's informed by myth and legend, that sort of thing. The modern worldview is, of course, the worldview that's informed by science. It's informed by the systematization of evidence and debate used to filter ideas from each other and that sort of thing. All the things that we associate with scientific progress, the scientific method, the scientific way of looking at the world. And then there's the postmodern view, which is more about competing narratives. Who gets to set the terms of the discussion? And that's not to dismiss science as such, but it's there to remind us that science is a human practice. And that if we're not skeptical about how the practice is conducted, then we run the risk of simply worshiping it as yet another god. I tend to lump the modern and postmodern views together for the sake of convenience, but you can see how they can be pulled apart just a little bit. So the chief distinction here is between pre-modern and modern/postmodern. Now, again, I don't claim that this distinction is the best way to describe the difference between fantasy and science fiction, that fantasy is informed by the pre-modern view and science fiction is informed by the modern postmodern view. But it seems like the most useful one to me for parsing the distinctions and using them as a guide to making things that have those labels. So the point of having a story embody or use a pre-modern outlook isn't to think that it's superior to the modern or postmodern outlook because it's in touch with deeper things or something like that. It's to broaden our sense of what's possible, what kinds of stories we can tell, and to what end. And the reverse is also true. A modern or postmodern worldview isn't necessarily about being dismissive of the pre-modern worldview. It's not about becoming disenchanted with the world. It's about becoming conscious of how things can be seen in a different way. So again, none of this is about making a case for one of these worldviews being the best. They are tools that you can choose from for helping sharpen and develop the kind of story you want to tell, and they encompass different things for different reasons. So the worldview, either one, whichever one you pick, it's going to come across in a bunch of different ways. It's going to come across through the characters that are in the story. The worldview will be embodied through the characters. It's going to be embodied in the setting, and it's going to be embodied in the narration and the storytelling, the story construction. And one of the things that came to me as I was rolling this around in my mind is that it is entirely possible for the narrative to be informed by a different worldview than the setting and the characters. And that can be done as a distancing device, as a way to comment on the action, to put some distance from it that can be used for the sake of getting the reader to think differently about the story, to not take what's presented for granted. One of the examples that comes to mind for this is Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I'm actually not the biggest fan of it, but I admire how it uses that as a way to accomplish this effect in the long run. Another one that comes to mind, which I am actually a big fan of, is Moorcock's Elric series. And that to me seems more informed by modern/postmodern thinking than Tolkien's Middle-earth, which is very much informed by pre-modern thinking. And that's fine because they're trying to do very different things. I think we have just as much to learn from Moorcock's more modern to postmodern tone and approach as we do from Tolkien's very clearly pre-modern framing and delivery. Something like Game of Thrones, I think that's more modern to postmodern, but I guess you could argue that it's more akin to something like Jacobean drama, which is absolutely the product of a pre-modern worldview, even though it is full of stuff that we would associate with a modern to postmodern worldview, that's violent, morally ambiguous material. So it also occurs to me that you can have a modern to postmodern world, but that you can look at it through a pre-modern or modernist lens. And I sometimes think this is what Hayao Miyazaki does in some of his work. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind. This is set in a post-apocalyptic world, one that's been devastated by mankind's machinations. But its sentiments, its framing, and especially its characterizations are a lot closer to Tolkien than something like, say, the Fallout series, which, by the way, I am a fan of. And then there's Mad Max. This is another favorite of mine. The action and the setting are very much modern to postmodern, but the storytelling, the framing, and the flavors of all of this material are very much in mythic and archetypal terms, especially when you get into the second movie and go forward from there. Even the first movie has a certain amount of this. It's basically a tarted up biker gang film, but it does feel like it's leaning hard into that one very mythic modern genre, the Western. So your choice of framing for the narrative and its construction, pre-modern or modern and postmodern, it's going to have as much influence, maybe even more, as the choice of the material in the story. And again, that material can be something from one of these domains, and it doesn't necessarily have to match, but you do have to understand what the consequences or the effects are going to be of mixing and matching like that. So being conscious of how the framing and material come from different domains, you can get that much more out of it. Ghibli and Mad Max, Elric. And I'm also thinking of stuff like Kentaro Miura's Berserk, which is informed at least as much by modern understanding of trauma and the process of acclimating people to violence as it is all of its dark fantasy elements. And then there's modern psychology or postmodern sociopolitics as good tools that we can have to expand the depth and scope of a story with pre-modern elements. And the reverse is also true. Good old Star Wars. It had modernist SF trappings, but at its heart, it was a pre-modern fairy tale. And one of the other things that tends to come up in these kinds of discussions about science fiction and fantasy, about choosing one or the other as a storytelling format or for its ingredient set, is how they may also be reflections of what kind of world you want to see or live in. And my own feelings about this are a little mixed, and that's in part because I'm just skeptical enough of my own worldview and my own sense of what kind of world I'd really like to live in to wonder if I would really like to live in any of the worlds that I come up with in one of my stories. And I think that may be why many of them tend to be stories that are about a tentative place in time, about a time of transformation, about leaping across the chasm into a new era. When people are groping their way through from this one thing to another newer thing, and how dangerous and uncertain all that is. What I do know with a lot of certainty is that I would really rather live in the here and now than in something like the Europe of the 30 Years' War. But I would not want to live in a here and now that had no sense of what the Europe of the 30 Years' War was like. I do not want to live in a present that is starved of some sense of contact with the past. And I do not want to live in a past that has no sense of how the present is slowly becoming something unheralded and new. By the way, before I shot this video, I ran this idea by a friend of mine, and he mostly agreed with it. And he said, I actually have my own theory that kind of complements yours. And I said, okay, what is it? And he said, fantasy is about when things don't change. And science fiction is about when things change too much. And again, that's really about a worldview. It's about a point of view. It's not necessarily about any one of the ingredients that goes into those things. So I will toss that one out there as a supplement to what I just said, because I have the feeling that a lot of you will probably also resonate with it. So anyway, there's the whole theory. See what you think of it. Love to hear your responses. And until next time, stay curious.